Good morning, everybody. A pleasure to meet you all virtually. My name is Rob Lothrop. I work for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. And my apologies, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because it represents a lot of the work we've been doing as a commission with respect to energy and protecting treaty resources development in the Columbia Basin. Let me draw your attention to the logo in the bottom right. CRITFC's member tribes are Yakima, Nez Perce, Warm Springs, and Umatilla. They founded the commission in 1977. And to have a unified voice in certain aspects of Columbia River fisheries management. Columbia River salmon are caught not only in the Columbia River, but all the way up to Southeast Alaska, where they comprise approximately 40% of the Chinook caught in Southeast Alaska. The image here is the spillway at the Dalles Dam. As many of you know, the Dalles inundated Celilo Falls. Celilo was a major trading center in the Northwest for thousands of years, and the fishery there was central to the culture of many tribal people and our member tribes. But that fishery still carries on in different times and places in the Columbia River. It is, we at the commission assist with rebuilding Columbia River salmon runs in the basin with transboundary management of salmon through the Pacific Salmon Treaty. And for those of you familiar with Columbia River salmon management, you won't be surprised that we're involved in energy issues. However, let me share an anecdote. When I first came to the commission in 1981 as a recent law graduate, I was assigned to develop recommendations to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, then it was called the Northwest Power Planning Council, for its fish and wildlife program. And I had the benefit of working with many experienced biologists from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, et cetera. And I was quickly immersed in Columbia River dam operations, both flows, seasonal flows, and daily dam operations. And you'll see the spillway at the Dalles is spilling a large amount of water. And if you look closely at the spillway, you'll see a little sort of black wall about halfway on the left side of the picture, and that was a spill wall built to maximize the effectiveness of water being spilled at the Dalles to pass juvenile salmon safely by the dam without them having to go through the turbines. That's one of many, many juvenile fish passage measures that have been installed on the Columbia River. I think that one cost about $40 million. And as juvenile fish passage measures go, that's relatively inexpensive, at least on the main stem Columbia. You'll see some transmission towers on the dam. What you don't see is the transmission lines on the Washington side of the river. Bonneville installed a major upgrade in the Big Eddy Knight system a few years back. That involved, um, I think, 2 or 3 years of consultation with the Yakima Nation for installation of that large transmission project. Um, as many of you know, the transmission corridor to the southwest to California has its kind of northern hub is right there at the Dalles. The DC transmission line, which goes basically straight from the Dalles to Sylmar, California, transmits just shy of 3,000 megawatts. It's been interesting to watch the direction of net flows change in recent years as solar has been, it continues to be developed in the Southwest. And back in the 80s, when Bonneville was proposing to expand the third AC transmission line, which in aggregate, the DC and the AC lines transmit just around 7,000 megawatts to California. One of the stated purposes of that expansion was to eliminate overgeneration spill at the dams. Overgeneration spill was water being spilled because there was no market for the electricity. Our member tribes and the state of Idaho and the National Wildlife Federation ended up litigating that with Bonneville because we were heavily dependent on overgeneration spill to pass juvenile salmon by the dams. And Bonneville had proceeded without developing an environmental impact statement. Ultimately, Bonneville, we prevailed in that litigation. Bonneville developed an EIS and kind of contemporaneously with that, developed a long-term intertie access policy and helped us deal with the hydro gold rush, so to speak, that was happening in the Northwest because of changes to PURPA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, that incentivized development of small hydro. In any event, just one more thing that is sort of represented in this image, at least when I look at it, having worked at CRITFC for 40 years now. And perhaps most importantly, in the foreground, you'll see a rock and some poles. And that is what's now basically, each of these rocks has their own names, but it generally, I think of this as the Lone Pine area. There is a tribal village there and has been since forever. It is situated on property administered by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it is one of the poorest communities, I think I can say that safely, one of the poorest communities in the Pacific Northwest. And it is, in some ways, remnants of the villages that were destroyed by the Dalles Dam on the north side of the river. That included Spearfish. And from the Dalles Dam up to Celilo Falls was a series of rapids that where tribal fisheries had occurred kind of forever, for millennia. So, CRITFC Energy Vision for the Columbia Basin. The first edition of this vision we published in 2003, shortly after the energy crisis of 2001. In 2001, the federal government curtailed salmon operations at the federal dams on the Columbia River. I got to give our colleagues at the public utility districts in the Mid-Columbia credit. They met their salmon requirements that year. They did not curtail operations. And I still remember conversations with Don Goddard, who was at Grant Beauty at that time, about how Grant was going to meet its obligations. And he didn't think it was particularly fair that the federal government was not going to meet its. That's an aside. So we published this energy vision. It was about 100 pages long. We made a number of recommendations so that energy resources development in the basin had the benefit of our recommendations and maybe could proceed in a fashion that avoided the kind of crises that occurred in 2001. And we called for additional energy conservation, development of specific reserves and reserve requirements, citing energy resources close to load, and a number of things. One of the things we did in that piece of work was observe how costly transmission is to serve load that occurs possibly only a few hours a year. So billions of dollars. Transmission is very expensive, as you all know, and lots of resources are spent, perhaps unnecessarily, to serve load that only occurs infrequently and may occur at a long distance from the generation that's serving that load. So we updated it in 2013, and so much has changed since 2013 in the world of energy and energy resources and energy policy that we thought that it was necessary to do an update in 21. And even since June, when we published the draft, things continue to evolve rapidly. One of the messages we heard loudly and clearly from our member tribes was, in 2001, it was about salmon. Our energy vision was focused on salmon, and with the potential impacts to uplands from additional wind and solar development and additional transmission development, our member tribes said, please expand this vision to include upland resources. And those upland resources would include wildlife, roots, berries, and cultural resources. In the energy vision, it's now out in draft. There's a section we've put in the document for citing renewable resources. And we've learned a lot since we put it out. I'll go into that a little bit more later. Another thing that we heard loudly and clearly from one of our member tribes in particular, and from other people that provided comments, is we need to say something more specifically about the lower Snake River dams and their future and alternatives to address the energy services they provide. Climate change has been a big deal for the Commission for 20 years or so. And because of our proximity to and the availability of expertise from the Northwest Power Planning Council, we've learned a lot over the last 40 years about energy conservation as a resource. There's probably no more localized energy resource than conservation. And I think, as Clint said, we need to think about proximities. providing energy services close to load. And then I'll say a little bit more about the future of the Columbia River Treaty as we proceed. The treaty, and here's another reference to the Dalles Dam, was negotiated between the United States and Canada starting in the late 50s and concluding in the early 60s for flood control and power. It fully ignored environmental concerns, and some of the features of the treaty refer to flood control flows measured at the Dalles, and the obligation of Canada to provide flood control services to the lower Columbia River. There's actually a dispute between the United States and Canada as to when and under what circumstances that flood control may be needed, whether that is at flows above 600,000 CFS as measured at the Dalles, that's Canada's position, or basically the current services that are being provided, which are flows roughly above 350 or 450, 350,000 CFS as measured at the Dalles. That's the US position. As you can tell, that's a big difference. And that's also a big difference in the amount of energy that the Columbia River will provide to who's ever taking it. So with that, let's go to the next slide. And please prompt me when we get about 10 minutes from the end of my allotted time.
Actually, Rob, we're relatively close to that right now, so can certainly squeeze out a little bit more time. And I know we got a little bit of a late start, just to provide some opportunity for questions and things too.
I'll do my best, Susan. Yeah, I lost about 15 minutes, I think.
Right. Yep, you certainly did. And
so I'm going to continue progressing here. This inset is of the Columbia River Basin. The green area is the area that was ceded by the four tribes, Yakima, Nez Perce, Umatilla, and Warm Springs, the light shaded green area, to the United States. The darker green areas are what they reserved. You can see that these areas occupy most of the interior Columbia River Basin. Forgive me for a little bit of inaccuracy in the green boundaries. That's just an editorial kind of mistake, but it's pretty accurate. And most of the salmon habitat upstream of Bonneville Dam in the Columbia River Basin currently exists in the ceded areas of our member tribes. They are carrying out about $100 million of fish mitigation activities in these areas on an annual basis. Next slide. This is language from the Yakima Treaty. And two things going on here. First, the image is actually Nez Perce entering the treaty grounds at Fort Walla Walla in 1855. There are about 1,400 Nez Perce on horseback. The little group around the flag is the U.S. Negotiating delegation, including Governor Isaac Stevens and Joel Palmer. So it gives you a little bit. This is a U.S. note taker that drew this image. Importantly, the fishing right clause has been to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, a bunch of times. And I want to draw your eyes to four things. We call these first foods. So the right of taking fish includes not only salmon, but lamprey, sturgeon, other fish resources. And with the right of hunting, gathering roots and berries. Collectively, we refer to those as first foods. And we have expanded the energy vision in its 2021 draft to deal with not just the fish resources, but with all of the first foods. And I might say that even in the last few years, uh, uh, this treaty language has been referenced by the Supreme Court with support, particularly in the Cougar Den opinion, and where Justice Gorsuch basically said in a concurring opinion, well, if Washington doesn't like the deal, it can try and renegotiate it, but a deal's a deal. That had to do with taxes, highway taxes. Next slide, please. So you'll see in the image here, a young man in the foreground. His elder is in the back. He's digging roots. He's probably being taught how to dig roots. Roots, as we mentioned, are one of the first foods. This is in an area where there are wind turbines, and it's not always possible for the owners of these wind turbines, or for the tribal root diggers to go into the areas owned by the owners of these turbines and dig roots. So roots are a very important cultural food. They're served in the tribal longhouses at important ceremonies, and really weekly, as in, I think of them almost like Sunday services. So this is a resource we need to be mindful of, in developing, and we are being mindful of, and developing this energy vision in terms of transmission and siting future energy resources, whether roots, cultural resources, and others are important resources to protect. One of the proposals we put in the draft was that tilled agricultural lands represent opportunities for siting energy development. Some of these tilled lands, particularly in Oregon, occur where there is serious groundwater depletion, and at least Umatilla Tribal Natural Resources Department saw the potential of a win-win scenario where siting resources could provide income for farmlands and protect, while being protective of tribal natural resources and restoring some groundwater. We put that in the draft, and we got a comment back from American Farmlands Trust. And they said, gee, can we work with you on this? We understand your concern for protecting tribal resources. We want to protect farmland. Can we achieve both ends? And by siting particularly solar in a community context, so that solar is developed closer to load. And we're also, there's some other features of our vision there. Let me go on to the next slide. This is a slide from, I borrowed from Congressman Mike Simpson's website, his congressional website. It describes one measure of the health of Columbia Basin salmon resources. And you'll see this particular measure is called smolt to adult return rates. The higher the return rate, the better. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council has said you need 2 to 6 with an average of 4 to have sustainable salmon runs. So in the Yakima, we're seeing about 2.4%. In the mid-Columbia, like John Day River, I'm sorry, there's so many mid-Columbias these days. The John Day River Basin, 3.5% SAR, and in the Snake River Basin, less than 1%. And I think that's one of the reasons, and Congressman Simpson says so, that why he has proposed breaching the Snake River dams in conjunction with roughly a $30 billion package of measures. It's important to note that Congressman Simpson has chaired the House Interior Appropriations Committee on and off for the last 10 years when the Republicans have been in charge. He's the ranking member now. He's fairly senior in the world of appropriations. Next slide, please. So, what are we looking at for the future of energy resources in the Western United States? Do we have enough energy to replace the Snake River dams, meet load growth, et cetera, et cetera? The Power Council, Northwest Power and Conservation Council, is taking a close look at this. We borrowed this graph from them. This is the Western Energy Coordinating Council's projections for future resource development in the WECC area. And the yellow and the blue represent solar with and without batteries. And you can see that in the far left, that's today. And on the far right, the bar is out there about it's up to 2045. Huge expansion of solar. I think people, regardless of whether you think this is going to be half that size or bigger than that, it's still very, very big. Let's go to the next slide. So what does this mean for the Columbia River? Well, people don't really think about it so much, in my experience. They just sort of assume that the Columbia River is this limitless battery that can integrate renewables into the Northwest energy grid. Well, it's not limitless. This is the results of the Power Council's Genesis modeling for the year 2031 for flows at the Dalles Dam. And you can see in this hypothetical model run that flows at about noon on July 15th, 2031 are projected to essentially be zero. Well, that's not good for fish. It's not a realistic assumption. I can't imagine that Endangered Species Act wouldn't kick in. We already have a letter from the US EPA that says these kind of flows are not realistic. EPA is already working on a TMDL for the Columbia River for temperature matters. And let me tell you, stopping the flow of the Columbia River during the brightest sunshiny parts of the day is not a good recipe for water temperatures or fish movement. We're looking at this very closely. We've asked the council to do some sensitivity studies. They've agreed. The question is when they will do them, whether they'll do them in the next 2 months or the next year. Next slide, please. So we've had multiple comments on the energy vision, including comments from former BPA administrators, BPA, the Power Council, the Northwest Energy Coalition. I think Renewable Northwest is getting us comments. We have extensive comments from the Oregon Department of Energy, US Fish and Wildlife Service, and so forth. And we're hoping, let's go to the next slide, to complete the energy vision this year. And as additional comments keep rolling in, we're doing our best to keep track of all of these innovative ideas. Most recently, um, a longtime energy planner that worked for Portland General um, said, well, you know, things have changed since 2014 when the Northwest region developed a recommendation to the State Department, US State Department, for renegotiating the Columbia River Treaty. And as people on this call will be reckoning with, where do you find the storage to make use of renewable resources? Well, there's a lot of storage. Most of the Columbia River water storage is in Canada, most of that operating storage. And uh, and what Robert McCullough pointed out to us was, and the storage on the Peace River system operated by BC Hydro is even larger than the amount of storage on the Columbia River system. And he basically posed a question to us. Why aren't we talking to Canada about how integrated operations with BC and the United States could serve both countries' desires to deal with greenhouse gases and energy innovations? Both countries have these policies. We should be talking about them. And the current treaty negotiations don't include a vision that is that far-reaching. So, next slide, please. I've heard this so many times as a staffer at the commission. I believe this is a food being prepared for an event outside the Umatilla Tribe's Longhouse. There's a whole creation story that kind of leads up to this, but I'm probably out of time. And it's not really my place to tell that story, though I've heard it many times over the years. Let me conclude by saying not only that that the tribes have a duty to speak on behalf of the salmon and the first foods, because they can't speak for themselves. So I'll conclude there.
Thank you,
take
Rob.
questions.
Yes, we are going to, had a little communication with Kathleen. Would really like the opportunity for people to ask you some questions with the presentation right in front of them. And then what we'll do is take a break and come back and do the mural exercise. But we'd love to give people an opportunity to ask you questions, Rob. So I am going to make that available. If anyone has a question for Rob or an observation they'd like to share with him, if you just raise your hand, I will get you in the queue. Anyone have anything for Rob right now?
Well, maybe this will precipitate a question. We're
Sure.
going to comment on the Puget Sound Energy's RFP in front of the WUTC by the end of the week.
All right.
I do have a question. If you can, you've referenced it a couple of times, and I thank you for the opportunity to have had a conversation with you earlier in the summer, which is this summer when I learned about your energy vision, and so much wanted you to share that, you being the tribes and the CRITFC. But specifically, you've mentioned a couple things about transmission. What are, if you could just summarize, what do you think are the top takeaways for our work on transmission from the energy vision that you presented?
So, couple things. One I did not present because it's beyond my expertise, but Elliot Mainzer is a former administrator of Bonneville. He's been a very helpful advisor on this project. He's currently the CEO of the California Independent System Operator, CalISO. And he said, you guys, CRITFC, really need to pay attention to the Northern Grid policy development exercise that is being hosted by the Northwest Power Pool and includes staffing from the Bonneville Power Administration. And I looked at the Northern Grid website and saw these fascinating charts about how net transmission flows of energy have changed in the last 10 to 15 years. It used to be Northwest energy flowed south. Now Southwest energy flows north. Same kind of changes in between British Columbia and Washington. So that was a big takeaway for me. Another takeaway is we had to deal with Snake River dam breaching and its energy consequences. We couldn't just kind of duck that issue. That was made clear. And I think the conversation with American Farmlands Trust was very illuminating. How can we find win-win solutions that protect resources important to all different types of Northwesterners? And American Farmlands Trust suggested some energy portfolios that would minimize transmission impacts. And maybe a fourth takeaway, we looked at an environmental impact statement that BLM and others prepared in the desert Southwest for siting solar. That's described in the Energy Vision document. They did a planning exercise down there that identified suitable solar development sites based on topography, endangered species listings, other availability of transmission, state-sensitive species listings, and so forth. And I know Washington's contemplating some kind of planning exercise like that. We had seen that kind of planning exercise used with small hydro development in the 80s. That plan still exists. It's been very successful. And we proposed that the federal government and the Northwest states should develop something like that. And from our vantage, because we're dealing with at least 3 states, depending on the issue, it seemed to make sense to have a federal partner in this. You don't want big inconsistencies between Oregon and Washington. We told that to Oregon, they seem to agree. We've suggested that to Kathleen, and she says, well, I'm hosting these processes, please come and participate. So there you go.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Kathleen, for that question. Any other questions right now?
I was just curious if you happen to know the generating capacity of the Snake River dams that are proposed for removal.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Joe. I think it's about 3,000 megawatts of capacity. The actual energy is roughly 30% of that, which really begs the question, those few hours a year in the middle of the night, in the winter, when we have a cold snap, what role do they play? And can that role be addressed by other energy resources, conservation, storage, localized generation? and how do you do that? So it's a great question, Joe.